Where are we? What is this? What are you guys up to in here?
We're in Orange County, the best place to start a defense technology company. We're sitting right here in our warehouse where we do all of our shipping and receiving and logistics, and also fabrication and prototyping of all kinds of different things, mostly focused on autonomous systems for the United States military.
Should we say far from Silicon Valley?
It is far from Silicon Valley. Look, I started my first business, Oculus, down here in Orange County. I moved up to Silicon Valley for a few years after Facebook bought Oculus. And after learning a lot about the Valley, I knew that I wanted to come back down here to start my next company. There are some businesses that have to be in the Valley. If you're starting an enterprise software company where 99% of your customers and 99% of your hires are going to be in the Valley, sure, be in the Valley. But if you actually want to hire from outside of the Valley, and if your customers are outside of the Valley, why pay so much money to be in a place where there's poor manufacturing prospects, not very good living options, not really good places to get a lot of space? There's a lot of companies that could have 2 years of burn down here in Orange County, and they only have 1 year of burn up in Silicon Valley, and they make this mistake of thinking that you have to be in Silicon Valley to do anything, and it's just not the case.
You're really interesting. I mean, you started Oculus and had this big idea for virtual reality, and VR is not new, but you did something other folks weren't doing. Facebook saw that.
Big implementation. I think everyone's had the big idea with VR. It was one of those obvious science fiction technology. It ranks up right there with like time machines and flying cars as that thing that's going to happen someday, but who knows when. And so it was really about the implementation. You know, everyone had the idea, but it's hard to buckle down and find the right way to solve the problem. Which is like, we're doing the same thing here. We've identified.
That's what I say. Like now you're doing defense tech. You see this, a lot of folks have been trying to do defense technology for a very long time, but now you're almost taking this Palmer Luckey mentality and applying it here. So tell me about that.
Well, we're taking a product approach. We're not a defense contractor. We are a defense product company. So we use our own money to decide what to build, how to build it, when it's done, and then we sell it to the government. And we only sell it when it works and when it can make a difference. And that's very different from a lot of defense contractors that push all the risk onto taxpayers, kind of are building things that don't really exist yet. And there's a place for that, there's a time for that, but it's not what I wanted to work on. I wanted to work on things that will save US taxpayers hundreds of billions of dollars and make the United States much safer in relation to our adversaries like Russia or China.
So take me, I think I read something about Chick-fil-A and dinner at your home, and you guys are putting together this pitch deck for what this company, and this company is named after a sword from Lord of the Rings. Am I correct?
Yes, it's named after Anduril, the sword of Aragorn, Narsil reforged, the flame of the West.
Why?
I think the kind of association there is like we see ourselves as kind of defending Western ideals and values, this idea of a liberal democracy with strong checks and balances and democracy. And we think that stands in stark contrast with some of our adversaries. We are trying to protect the United States and its allies that believe in those values against people who do not value those things, against people who don't really care about human rights, who don't care about privacy, who do not care about strong rule of law and a strong democracy. And so we felt that Aragorn's sword, Anduril, the flame of the West, was a pretty good thing to model ourselves after.
So, and by the way, I love that we can hear like helicopters overway as you're saying that.
We're right here next to John Wayne Airport. So it's a fantastic airport named after one of the best movie cowboys there is. And so yeah, we have cool planes coming in and out of here all the time. We have a helipad up on the roof, a lot of helicopters coming in and out. So it's a very fun, dynamic place to be.
So you're at dinner at your place with some executives who became founders in the company as well. You're eating Chick-fil-A in your home in Orange County. You sold Oculus, have millions of dollars. You don't have to do something else, but you had this idea to do something else. You saw a $1 billion business doing something else. Take me to that pitch deck as you guys are eating Chick-fil-A. What was the most interesting part of that pitch deck that you were talking about with the future of what this company could be?
So I guess two things. One, it's not just a $1 billion thing. Like, this is a multi-hundred billion opportunity. You can save the United States hundreds of billions of dollars a year in defense spending and be a multi-hundred billion dollar company. And the most interesting thing about this opportunity, I thought, that we were all looking at, is that it is, like, this opportunity shouldn't exist. There should be hundreds of small defense startups that are all working this way. There should be all of the major tech companies involved deeply with the Department of Defense, but there's this weird market distortion where these companies that do work with consumers are unwilling to also do work with the Department of Defense. They're unwilling to take the PR hit, they're unwilling to be controversial, and because of that, our nation suffers. So we're in this place whereby we should not be able to punch as hard as we do. But because there's so few people that are working in the defense technology space relative to the consumer space, there are, of course, many great companies. I don't want to make it sound like it's a desert, but there is not nearly as much activity in the space as there should be. That's why we wanted to come in and build a place where the best people in the technology industry could come and work on these problems. A lot of the smart people that are in the tech space, they're not going to go work at Lockheed. They're not going to go work at Raytheon. They're not going to work at Boeing. They don't want to work on the types of problems that those companies are working on. They don't want to work on those problems in the type of way that those companies work on them. And so you need to build, like, dare I say it, a Silicon Valley style company that will hire people from the technology industry and work on national security problems.
And I want to get into all that because interesting ethical issues there, interesting time to be doing this, especially with a lot of very, very liberal folks in Silicon Valley who oftentimes help shape the agendas of these companies. But I want to go back to this pitch deck. Autonomous long-range bombs, attack drone swarms, perimeter security poles. Like, give me just like, that's such a Silicon Valley new, it could be very dystopian way of looking at kind of the future. What was on this pitch deck that was just fascinating to investors when they were looking at it? What was this vision that you laid out that you think is the future?
I mean, the vision is really clear. The United States military needs to have the best technology. The future of technology and warfare is going to be defined by artificial intelligence and autonomous systems. We have to lead there. We cannot allow Russia and China to lead there. There's a great quote from Vladimir Putin where he was going around trying to convince students to work in their defense industry. And speaking about artificial intelligence, he said, quote, he who wins in this sphere will become the ruler of the world. And he's not saying that because he thinks he's going to lose. He's not saying that because he thinks they're in a position of weakness. He thinks it's because they're in a position of strength, that they're going to win using these modern tools. And so it's easy to say, oh, I'm worried about dystopia. This thing sounds dystopian. I think that a lot of people over-index on dystopian aspects of technology because it's easier to get clicks and sell books and tell stories and do exciting things. I've talked to a lot of science fiction authors who tell me that, like, yes, technology in their books has all these scary implications. That's not because they actually believe that's what the future looks like for technology. You just can't sell a book based on the story of, in the future, technology is going to be better, and it's going to make people safer and save lives, and things are generally going to be about the same but better.
But we are at a very specific point. I want to get into the specifics of what you guys are working on, but we are at a certain point where the last couple of years, that narrative, the pendulum has come this way, and for good reason. You have foreign actors bad actors using Facebook to manipulate democracy.
Sure.
You have people wondering, you have data breaches, people wondering the social contract they signed over when they handed over their data. You have a good reason to take a step back and wonder, should we trust our tech companies the way that they've asked us to, or are we entering a time where we need to take a step back? I think that's fair to say.
So I think it somewhat is. Remember that a lot of this stuff's been going on in other areas, other arenas. Technology is just the current public square. That's where these types of things are going to be centered. So it's not like society has changed. It's just technology is more important than it used to be. So of course it's going to be part of the game. But the importance of defense technology transcends any kind of recent political environment or recent news environment. The companies that work on defense don't make their money on one administration. They're not just around for a few years to go after one opportunity. The need for the United States to have the best defense technology is enduring, and it will endure for decades. I mean, I would be working on this technology whether or not there were data breaches, whether or not Hillary Clinton was in office, whether or not any of these social media companies were coming under scrutiny. Like, that's not the reason that I'm building this technology, and it's not the reason we need it. In fact, there's a pretty strong argument to be made that this stuff shows even more than normal that we need to be investing in this stuff, that we need to be investing in national security in the technology space because the other players are becoming so fluent in the language, because they've finally caught up to the point where they can hijack our own systems against us. That's terrifying, and that makes this the best time of any to get into this.
So let's talk about what you're actually building. So border control technology. Take me through your first kind of big project and the stuff that, I know the headlines have been you guys are building the digital wall for Trump.
Our core system is a sensor fusion platform called Lattice. So Lattice can take data from thousands of different sensors and fuse into a single cohesive real-time 3D model of very large areas. Then you use machine learning to tag everything in that model with metadata so you can sort it, filter it, process it, run predictive analytics on it, and push it out to people both in command and control centers and also out in the field in real time. The goal is to turn soldiers into superheroes, telling them exactly where everything is, taking this information and putting it into heads-up displays so they can see exactly where the enemy is, exactly where their backup is, exactly where the dangerous places are, exactly where the safe places are. And this has all kinds of applications, whether you're talking about active operations, border security, military-based security, critical infrastructure security. So like, yeah, we've deployed with Department of Homeland Security and Customs and Border Protection on the border. We're also deployed at several US military bases. We have some other stuff that we're doing that I can't talk about. But like, this is a system that allows people to work seamlessly with autonomous systems and with artificial intelligence. And allowing those two things, people and machines, to work together in the most efficient way possible is going to be key to the future of keeping our country safe.
And explain how the artificial intelligence, because people have tried to build, border security digitally for a very long time. People have tried to do this. So take me through, what's kind of the killer app of this? What is the artificial, and how is the AI better than systems of the past? I saw someone say, describe it as almost Pokemon Go and artificial intelligence. Describe exactly how that works and how it's better than systems in the past.
Well, the big difference between autonomous systems and manned systems is that with manned systems, you can't scale them up without scaling the number of people that are using them. So like, let's say you're defending a military base. You only have so many people that can watch cameras and look out for stuff. And you can't distribute them all through the environment, especially in rugged environments where people really don't want to be hanging out. With autonomy, if you do all your processing out at the edge of the network, you can deploy sensors and drones all over the field, all around your perimeter, and basically scale up the number of virtual brains and virtual eyes watching these feeds infinitely. Rather than having 10 people monitoring one drone, you could have one person monitoring 10 drones. And you could just flip that equation upside down by orders of magnitude. And so it becomes a lot more feasible to actually have a perfect understanding of everything that's going on, rather than just a few blips here and there with the manpower that you can spare. So we want people to know everything that's going on, know when they're in danger, know when they need to mount a certain type of response, and basically never be going into a situation under or over prepared for what they're going to be encountering once they get there.
And so they see, and I saw some of the technology, they gave me a demo, so you see it says 98% human or 97% human, and the algorithm learns, right?
Exactly, and so it's multimodal sensor fusion. So we're not just taking one sensor and feeding it into this edge.
Just say that in layman's terms.
So multimodal sensor fusion, meaning that we're not just taking data from one sensor and feeding it into a model. We're actually feeding data from all kinds of different sensors. So radar, LiDAR, electro-optical, signals intelligence, vibration, acoustic. We can feed all of these different things into a single system that uses all these different sensors to have a very good idea of what's going on. It makes it very difficult to get past this system. This is not something where you can trick just one sensor. You'd have to trick a whole bunch of different types of sensors, and it's very unlikely. And what that allows us to do is detect where all of the people are, where, let's say, hostile drones are, non-hostile drones, aircraft, even animals. We spend a lot of time just tracking coyotes and cows walking around.
What type of people have you caught? How does it actually work when someone is tracked?
So the way that it typically works, and it of course depends on which customer is using it, but usually they can basically set up rules, say, hey, tell me if someone is, let's say, crossing this perimeter that we've set, or tell me if somebody is coming through this area that we need to keep secure. And then when it detects something that matches the description, it can send a notification to the nearest person and say, hey, there's this thing that we think is worth a person looking at. We think that it's a person that meets the requirements that you've defined, and we think that it's time for a human to intervene in this. And it can pop that directly to their mobile device, and they're able to respond appropriately.
Does it prioritize if it's someone you are able to see and visualize smuggling drugs, or a family crossing the border? How does that technology work?
I mean, this is a tool for knowing everything that's going on. I think that more information is always better. I think when the United States military, in particular, has more information, I think they make better decisions. I think that actually goes for all government agencies. There's very few policies that I think would be better crafted if the people crafting them had no idea what the problem is. Our goal is to give people information about everything that's going on so that they can make the right decisions in all of these. And it's not necessarily prioritizing those things, it's telling people everything that's going on. And in most of these areas, you want people to know no matter who's in the area, not leave it up to a machine to decide if someone who's in an area where nobody is supposed to be is somebody that is worth notifying for.
So there's no question, we want safe border control, right? And the system as it is can be dangerous and broken.
And I think it's, that's been bipartisan for a very long time. You look at decades. I think people on both sides of the aisle agree. We don't want drugs moving back and forth. We don't want weapons back and forth. We don't want human trafficking. We don't want sex trafficking just free flowing across the border. I think where people usually disagree is on immigration policy. People have different opinions on what they want immigration policy to be. But immigration policy and border security though to some people they seem intertwined, are very, very separate issues. No matter what your immigration policy is, you still want to have strong border security. You still want to be able to prevent drugs and weapons and human trafficking back and forth across the border. And that, even if you wanted to have completely open immigration, you still actually want very strong border security.
But you guys are working with the government, you're working, and right now this is the Trump administration who has been known for the immigration ban and some of these very controversial policies, including family separation. So I think what we're seeing is more tech companies don't get to just step out and say we're just the platform. You see that happening increasingly. So I'd be curious to know, what will there be a line you draw with your technology if it's implemented in a certain way?
I think we're so far away from that happening. The United States is a strong democracy. We have strong rule of law, strong checks and balances. We have a free press. I'm much more concerned about other countries like Russia and China building technology that they use to oppress their own people and also expanding their sphere of influence over other countries. I'm actually very optimistic about what's happening here, and we can't afford to be political to the point where we say, we're going to just stop working on technology because the guy that I wanted to win for president didn't win for president. You have to look at national security as something that takes decades to accomplish, that can only be done if people put aside politics and focus on keeping the country safe. And I think that you've seen that in the defense industry, and I don't think anything is going to happen or could happen in the United States because we have these strong checks and balances.
So it's a societal or political question is what should happen to the folks that your technology is able to capture at a better rate.
Well, again, it's a policy issue. If people want to change the policy there, the right thing to do is talk about what they want the policy to be, call their representatives, vote. The right thing to do is not to cripple the agencies tasked with enforcing the law and say, I don't like the law, I'm going to give you worse tools that make you less safe so you can't enforce the law. I think it's the same thing with the military. If we don't like what our military is doing, we should call our representatives, we should try to get out of wars that we don't want to be in. I'm a very non-interventionist person. I want less war. I don't want to be overseas interfering in people's affairs unless it's strictly needed. But the right way to accomplish that is not to take away tools from those people in the field and say, you're going to be less safe, you're going to be less effective. That's how we're going to get what we want.
Make the ethical case for this technology. How is it more ethical than the way the current border is secured?
Well, again, it's not just about the border. This is about national security, which includes the border, it includes military bases, it includes active operations. In all of these cases, giving people more information allows them to make better decisions. It means that I don't go over-prepared into a situation where I don't need to. It means that I'm not going into an ambush, not having the tools that I need to keep myself safe. This gives people the ability to make the best possible decisions by giving them the best possible information.
And this is technology that would be created if it weren't the Trump administration, under any administration.
I don't know if it would be created. I know that I would be creating it either way. Whether it was Donald Trump or Gary Johnson or Hillary Clinton in office, I'd be working on this because I don't choose what's important when it comes to national security based on who's in office. And just because my candidate that I prefer wouldn't win, that doesn't mean that I think we need to let Russia and China build better in technology and for them to have the lead in this. I don't think that you can afford to say, let's let them get ahead by years or decades until someone that I like gets into the White House.
I think it's an interesting point. You keep talking about Russia and China.
Well, I think they're the biggest threat.
So
I think it's not internally. The biggest threats to the United States are external. Like, you have China, China has internment camps. They are mass tracking their citizens. They are not thinking about artificial intelligence in an ethical or moral way. They're not thinking about the ethical implications the way that we are. You have Russia saying they're literally going to use artificial intelligence to rule the world. And I think the United States has to respond in kind to that. We can't afford to say, just let Russia have the best military technology. Let's have China have the best military technology. I'd rather have us moving quickly, trying to build the best technology for the United States and stumbling along the way than just completely stalling out and ensuring that we lose.
So do you think, is the United States at risk of losing global supremacy when it comes to defense technology and being this global power?
Yes, I do think that that is a very serious risk. That's why I started this company, because I felt that risk very, very acutely.
And I mean, take me through what China's doing. Our adversaries are using technology, you'd say, in not an ethical way. So what in that way are you seeing them use artificial intelligence, some of this type of thing? And then what are you keeping in mind when it comes to ethics and the AI that you're building and how it goes out into the world?
So I think you see a lot of willingness on the other side to use autonomous systems that can autonomously acquire and fire on targets without any kind of human intervention. And that's not something the United States military believes in. I think that's not going to be something that it believes in. You also have China in particular using technology and mobilizing technology to track their citizens on a mass scale, tying together what they're doing, what they're saying, what they're searching for on the internet with their phone numbers, their addresses, their purchases, basically building a perfect model for perfect oppression of their people. And I don't think that that's something we want to build in the United States. Like, I would never build a tool that would be used to domestically track and mass identify every single American. I think that Americans also don't want that. And I think that if we let China continue on the path that they're on, they're not just going to be applying this technology to their own citizens. They will apply it to their neighbors and eventually to people all around the world.
Ethically, what are you thinking about? Where will you draw the line when it comes to the tech you're building? And I want to also get into the larger stuff you're building, but when it comes to this particular example, ethically, where will you draw the line?
Oh man, I mean, that's a broad question. AI can do so many things.
Sure.
And you have these questions in the self-driving car industry too. Like, you know, how does a car decide which person that it's going to crash into when it's in a situation where it has to crash into somebody?
How do you think it should?
So I think that this stuff is actually going to be defined by the courts. I think it's going to be defined by, I think it's going to be defined by it actually just happening over time. I think it's very difficult to step into a new technological area and try to preemptively regulate it before there's any kind of real world examples or consequences. That's not to say there will never be any kind of bumps in the road. There will be things that happen that are suboptimal, but I don't think that we can preemptively regulate that we do not yet fully understand.
Well, so when it comes to this type of technology for border control and also in all the different ways you deploy it, so the AI, is it you don't keep the data for a certain you only keep the data for a certain period of time. You don't do mass identification. Take me through some of those, the places where you guys stop yourself.
Well, as far as the data goes, it's not our data. The government owns the data. So the retention policy is up to the individual government agencies. In most cases, they're wiping the data after some period of time. In other cases, they need to preserve it for legal purposes or for compliance purposes. And I think that it's actually not that bad to have more transparency in the process and to have more information about what's actually going on. But I think in terms of like mass identification, we don't build tools that are trying to tie specific identities to the people that we're tracking. Look, we're trying to secure areas, we're trying to aid in active operations, and that involves saying, hey, there's a group of 5 armed guys over there that you didn't see that our drone did, and we're going to warn you about them so that you know that they're coming. We're not taking that data and feeding it into some kind of database to try and identify who person 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 are. As far as we're concerned, they're just person 1, person 2, person 3, person 4, person 5, if that makes sense.
It definitely does, and I think, and I'm interested in it because like that human part of like that person 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is also the family trying to cross the border, and that data is going to the government and some of these more controversial policies. You fall into the line of this technology is happening and we need to do a better job, and not we need to kind of, as a tech company, take a stance or look at that human impact.
Look, we're looking at the human impact, but I think what you're kind of edging at is somewhat infeasible. I mean, we're trying to say, here are all of the people that are crossing in this area they shouldn't be crossing. We're going to let people handle the problem. There's no, in fact, what you may be suggesting would be introducing more into the system of like, oh, we're going to try to figure out what type of people they are and identify them better, and then have the machine decide who passes and who doesn't. That's not a good way to handle the problem. I think it's far more ethical to just track everybody and hand it over to people. Again, if you don't like the job that people have, if you don't like the laws they have to enforce, change the law. Don't take information away from the people and give it to machines.
It's this interesting point that I think a lot of tech companies are grappling with of at what point does the machine make the decision and at what point does the human make the decision?
And it's different for every technology. In our case, we're very, very far away from that. Again, we track where things are, we track where threats are, we track where potential threats are, and we feed those to people, and people make the final decision, not our system. And that is the way that we think it's most useful.
So this is just one interesting use case. Also, actually, here's an interesting one. Are you guys worried about drug cartels when you're going out? You guys spent some time in a trailer out, you know, in some pretty dangerous areas doing this. Are you worried about drug cartels and your own safety when you're out there doing these deployments?
Yes, and we have to make sure that we take appropriate measures to keep ourselves safe.
So tell me about what else you guys are working on, because this is only one part of it. I think a lot of folks have seen, this is kind of a controversial one, people see it in the headlines, but there's so much other stuff here you guys are working on. Take me through some of the other stuff.
Well, so all of the things kind of tie into our core product, Lattice. You know, Lattice takes all of the sensor data and fuses it all together and then pushes it back out to people and autonomous systems so they can all seamlessly work together. So we're working on an autonomous firefighting vehicle called Sentry that ties into the system so that it can know how fires are spreading, where they're going, and then autonomously fight fires using that data. We are building multiple helicopter drones that are able to do autonomous perimeter searches, autonomous search and rescue, basically anything where you would need to go and find out everything that's going on in a really large area beyond what a person could ever patrol, but at a much lower cost than a manned aircraft. So rather than having 10 people working on one aircraft, you can have one person manning 10 of these aircraft. And with our drones, you don't manually pilot them. You don't fly around them like with a remote control like you would do if you were using a drone you bought at Best Buy or something. With our drones, they have an AI core on board that's doing all of its own processing and all of its own interpretation of the sensor data, and you just tell it what you want it to do, and then it does the rest. Think of it as like an AI pilot that you can give instructions. So you can say, hey, I want you to patrol this perimeter and tell me if anyone is crossing it. I want you to watch this checkpoint and see if there's anything that looks like a suspicious vehicle that is approaching the checkpoint. I can say, I want to go and look for all the people in this large area during a search and rescue operation and send back a map as soon as you find somebody and tell me exactly where they are and where the nearest responder is. Those are the types of things you can do with autonomous drones that you just can't feasibly do if you have one person, one drone flying every single thing.
What do you think the future of warfare looks like?
I think the future of warfare is going to be defined by artificial intelligence and autonomous systems working seamlessly together with people. People kind of being the common sense and logic that powers the decision-making process, and autonomy being the thing that actually makes a lot of the under-the-hood stuff happen. So getting things to the right place, getting information about the right things, making sure that people have all of the information that they could possibly have when they're making a decision so they make the best informed decision. If you can have better logistics and better information every time than your enemy, you will be a lot more successful.
Can you paint the picture? I know we speak broadly about it, but can you paint the picture of what that looks like? I mean,
sure. Every soldier is going to have close overwatch by autonomous systems. They're not going to get ambushed by people on roads. They're not going to get ambushed by people who are coming out of nowhere, because they are going to have overwatch provided by autonomous systems that a person could never provide. You're going to have convoys that, again, never run into the kind of trouble that they will now, because they're able to look ahead and detect ahead of where they actually are, because they can work as a distributed mesh of different systems rather than try to do everything just from the point of view of this one vehicle. You'll have perfect command and control, where the person who's deciding how to deploy assets and what they need to be doing can see everything that's going on in full 3D at correct scale and understand intuitively the relationships between all these different units and the enemy that they're up against. If we can do all of those things and a lot of other things that we're going to be working on in the future, the United States military is going to be in a much better position than it is today.
You're genuinely worried that Russia and China are getting ahead when it comes to technology?
Yes, the United States is very good at building things that are iterative improvements. So we're very good at building a faster fighter jet, or a bigger bomber, or a deeper submarine, or a longer aircraft carrier. Things that people understand, things that congressmen understand, things that people will vote for and support because it makes sense to them. They've seen these kind of same things for decades, getting on close to a century now for some of these technologies. Transformational technologies like autonomous systems and artificial intelligence are much harder to sell to people, but Russia and China are doing an excellent job of embracing them as the future of warfare. So I think we're going to keep building the things that fought the last war. I worry about the United States' capabilities when it comes to the next wars and the next major conflicts up against foes who are not trying to compete against us at our own game.
It's just interesting because you have a gaming background, and and I hear the way you're talking about this almost in like a gaming capacity of and a lot of the technology you're building. I can see just some parallels.
Well, the parallels go back centuries, if not millennia. I mean, if you look at what chess is one of the earliest games that has still stuck around, and it is very much a game of war. And I think that it's because it's all about strategy, it's about logic, it's about anticipating what your enemy is going to do and about having more information than they do. The difference between what we're trying to do in chess is that in chess, both people are on a perfectly even playing field. We don't want the US to be on an even playing field. We want to be so much better technologically that we are able to deter people from even getting into a conflict, to deter people from even trying to oppress their neighbors and their own people, because they know that there is another force out there that is much stronger than they are, that they would never be able to compete against. We don't want a game of chess. We want a game of chess where we have chess pieces and they have checker pieces.
Would you consider yourself an American company?
Yes, we are an American company.
So would you not do business with China?
No, we would not do business with China. We would do business with the United States allies, but we absolutely would not do business with China or Russia. I think that would be defeating a lot of the purpose of what we're doing.
So going back...
By the way, barring, of course, some massive geopolitical upheaval where everything shifts around and different people take control and it becomes a totally different situation. I'll say we would not work with today's China, and we definitely would not work with today's Russia. But the hope is, of course, that the countries get better. The goal is not to have a boogeyman that goes on for decades and centuries and never ends. I hope that they get to a place where they do have strong rule of law and a true democracy and competition between different parties. But we're far away from that happening, and I'm not that optimistic about things changing in the near term.
You're interesting because you're a contrarian when it comes to Silicon Valley. A lot of Silicon Valley engineers are taking a stand with their companies. Look at Google Project Maven, and
Sure.
Google employees saying they're not comfortable with, you know, an AI program Google is doing with the Pentagon. They're not comfortable with what this could look like in the future. Are we
Sure.
building weapons of war? Do you think it was the right decision for them to protest this?
No, I don't. I don't think that they've thought about these things nearly as much as the people who really understand these issues have. And the people who, like the people at Google who worked on Project Maven, they didn't do it for the money. There's kind of this narrative that they did this for the money, then they got caught, and then they had to back out and do the right thing. They were doing it because they thought it was the right thing. That was something that was going to save lives, reduce collateral damage, and make a serious difference in a lot of people's lives. They pulled out because of bad PR, not because it was a bad thing to work on. And I think that they pulled out because, like you pointed out, there are employees that are protesting in these companies, and it's reasonable for them to protest. You know, they didn't sign up to work on defense stuff, and
right.
so they're concerned about that. A lot of them said,
we're not in the business of war. We don't want to work on this AI technology that we have certain standards for. We don't want to watch it be weaponized for war.
And I can understand why they say that. At the same time, I think that it's very myopic to look at this as a fight between the US deciding to work on this technology or not, their company deciding to or not, and then just saying, oh, I don't mind if Russia and China beat us as a result. How terrible would it be? I don't think it's going to happen, but imagine if them pulling out of that project resulted in China or Russia being the more powerful military than ours. I don't think that that's a good outcome for anybody. And you have to remember that, yes, there are these people who are protesting, and they're being very loud voices and saying, I don't want to work with the military, I don't want to give them these AI tools. But at the same time, they make up a vocal minority even in the Valley. I think most of Silicon Valley agrees, whether they're Democrats or Republicans or Libertarians or anything else, they agree the United States should have better military technology than Russia or China. But the people who believe that are not the loudest. They're not the ones that make the headlines and share the most tweets and make their voice heard the biggest. They're often focused on getting actual work done. And so you have this weird dynamic where this very vocal minority that isn't aligned with most of Silicon Valley and definitely isn't aligned with most of the country is kind of dominating the narrative and making people think that Silicon Valley is against defense when it really is not.
Well, I think a lot of them are also looking at President Trump and his policies on immigration, and immigration has been such a big part of it.
Again, I think that's very short-sighted to say the person I don't like is in office. We should just let the Russians and the Chinese go.
Or do we trust this administration with data and surveillance and using these tools in a smart way? I think there's also that argument.
Yeah, and I think it's short-sighted. You can't do this work on a president-by-president timeline. You can't say, my person won, time to work on technology. Oh, my person lost. Time to stop working on technology. You have to keep working on this stuff because our enemies are not going to be stopping every few years based on who's in office. And you know why? Because only one person gets to be in office and they never stop. And that's why we have to beat them so we don't become a country like that, so that they don't take those values and export them around the rest of the world. It's really amazing in the United States we have the choice to work on this stuff. That's the best part. In Russia or China, you don't have the choice to do that. And you definitely don't have the choice to wait for the next party because the same guy is going to stay in office forever. I think that there's this idea of kind of this cultural equivalence, that different cultures or different countries are all just different but equally good. And it's just not the case. The United States is a better culture than these cultures where mass surveillance is the norm, where locking up political dissidents is the norm, where never relinquishing your office is the norm. I mean, we are better than the countries that are doing that, and we need to make sure that the rest of the world has the kinds of freedoms that we do.
So when we talk about mass surveillance, and I think that's something a lot of folks worry about, especially as we put these devices in our home that are increasingly could be turned on. I mean, what do you think, if you look at the team that you guys are working with?
Sure.
You know it's a controversial team. It's Palantir, which has come under fire for government surveillance, and there have been some ethical questions. Peter Thiel, who's a very interesting and also polarizing figure, and you, who have a really equally as interesting background that's very contrarian to the values of Silicon Valley. Why is this the right cast of characters to do this?
Because we're willing to work on unpopular things when they're important. You shouldn't pick the problems you work on based on what will make you the most popular at the Silicon Valley VC parties. You should pick the things you work on because you think it will make a big difference in the world. And people say this all the time. Like in HBO's Silicon Valley, they joke about it. He says, I don't want to live in a world where someone else makes the world a better place better than we do. And there's a lot of people in Silicon Valley who say that, but you're not making nearly as much impact on the world working on advertising, monetization, or better facial recognition for a social media app than you are literally saving the lives of people in the US military and all of the people that they defend. That, to me, that is making a difference in the world. That is making the world a better place, even if it's unpopular with the people who are the loudest voices.
You worked on virtual reality to treat PTSD back in the day.
I worked at an Army-funded research lab before I started Oculus, and that really started off a long process of me thinking about these problems. And I learned a lot about how broken the process was, how far behind the technology was in the United States, and it really stunned me because I assumed growing up that we had the best technology in the military, that we were decades ahead in these secret research labs, and it just wasn't the case. And I realized as I was at Oculus and learned more about this, met more people in the defense community, that this wasn't just the case in the military virtual reality community, it was the case across the entire defense industry. And that really worried me.
What does the future of war look like when it comes to virtual reality and these things that you kind of picked up having been at the forefront of some of the latest innovation with VR?
I mean, virtual reality is a useful tool. Augmented reality is a useful tool. You never want to use a tool just for the sake of using the tool. But in this case, virtual reality is a great tool for visualizing where all of this information is coming from, how it's all being stitched together. Augmented reality is extremely useful because it allows you to take that information and place it directly into the field of view of soldiers who are in the field, giving them basically superhuman vision and perception where they can see through buildings, see through mountains, see everything that's going on rather than seeing what their eyes allow them to see.
I think augmented reality is really interesting too. I know we've spoken a lot about VR. You see what Apple's launched with augmented reality. Explain this to me, so visualize this. So how exactly does that work for a soldier in the field? How will you see augmented reality and the stuff that you're working on?
Well, you want to take all the information that you're capturing from Lattice, which fuses all this sensor data together into a single cohesive model, and then pipe the relevant information to people who are in the field. So if I'm on one side of a hill and a drone picks up a group of armed people on the other side of the hill headed my way, I'm not going to be able to see them with my own eyes. But because I'm plugged into Lattice, it can send me that information and show exactly, even straight through the hill, where they are, what they're doing, what they look like, and allow me to plan accordingly. And you can imagine this scaled up to a much larger level. You can have hundreds or even thousands of people that are all interacting, all knowing exactly where all of their backup is, exactly where the enemy is, and maneuvering in much better ways, acquiring targets in a much better way, and even retreating in a better way if they know the best path, the safest path, if they can all agree on the right place to rally, the right targets to hit. Augmented reality is going to take off, I think, in industry and enterprise and the military long before it takes off in the consumer space. That's not to say there won't be successful AR companies, but I think you're going to see a heads-up display on every soldier long before you see a heads-up display on every person in this room.
It also feels, when you talk about augmented reality and being able to see people, it almost feels like war is going to begin to look like a video game. You almost see like Call of Duty, but in real life.
I mean, I think it's actually the other way around. Those games are pulling from real-life military technology. I mean, like the concept of a heads-up display in a video game, showing your ammo feed and showing your targeting reticle, that doesn't come from video games. That comes from fighter jet and attack helicopter technology, and then made its way into these games. So, I mean, it's really what people have always wanted. We have this kind of tech in fighter jets and in helicopters where we can augment their view with relevant information and show where the enemy is. They've wanted this for ground troops for a very long time, but nobody's ever built the back end that actually makes it possible. So
That's what you want to do.
Exactly, well, and that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to build that back end that lets us turn soldiers into superheroes and give them perfect omniscience of everything that's going on around them with the enemy and with their own people. And I think that like the similarities to video games are only because video games draw from military technology. This is really an evolution of something that the military has always wanted for all of their people that's just never been technologically feasible.
I mean, it's fascinating to think that that's, and also for safety reasons. I understand where it comes from. And then you have the opposite side where I remember visiting the drone factory in Israel and them saying, the first time I heard the phrase of, you got to be careful because you're using the drone like from afar and it takes the humanity out of it. And so I'm visualizing also a world and that you have the screen in front of you, the augmented reality, it feels like the video game that's playing off of this. Do you worry that it'll be taking out that human element of war?
No, I think that the people who are out there in the field very strongly feel what their responsibility is and that they're not going to lose sight of that responsibility because you give them more technology.
You don't think that the technology will make people less human and war, which is such a human thing?
No, I do not think so. I think that these people really deeply understand their responsibility and they take the taking of life very seriously. I don't think that if you give them better tools to see where their enemy is, that will make the war less human. I don't think that if you let them know when they're going to be ambushed, that's going to make it less human. And even if it actually did reduce it, I still don't know that I would want to take it away from them. It's very hard to say I would rather have soldiers be ambushed and killed rather than reduce their humanity by some unknown percentage. I want to keep these guys safe. I want them to come back home alive. That's the technology that I'm trying to build.
Although with a screen in front of you, it is easier. I feel less human when I look at my phone and when I'm looking at people's filtered lives. You don't. I mean, it is easier. The human brain does think in different terms. People have talked historically about that type of thing when it comes to drones and how they. And that doesn't mean drones shouldn't exist, but it is something people think about.
I think that there is a huge difference in, let's say, remote drone strikes, which are manually operated tasks, or you scrolling through Instagram, and let's say having enemy soldiers highlighted in my view in a fog where I would never have been able to see them. I really don't think those people are going to lose sight of their humanity when they are still in a war zone, under fire, risking their lives. We are a long ways away from this hypothetical, the hypothetical you're talking about goes all the way back to the original Star Trek even and before. There was one episode, there was an original episode of the original Star Trek where these two societies just stopped fighting wars. They basically just flipped a random number generator and then exterminated some set of their population instead of bothering with war. I think we're so far away from that. I think we're actually thousands of years away from that.
But so how do we make sure we don't get to that? I mean, say what you will about you. You're this kind of mad scientist, kind of interesting, contrarian person who is building out a lot of the stuff too,
sure.
As you say, with a goal in mind to keep people safe. Oftentimes we get all the way there and we forget how we got there, which I think we are seeing with technology. So what do you think is the biggest thing we can do to make sure we don't get there?
The biggest thing that we can do is to think about how the ethics of these things play out, to think about building the right systems. And like I said earlier, I'm confident that the United States will figure this out. We already have strong policies around how to use weapon systems, how to use remote weapon systems, how to use these drone systems. I think we're going to continue evolving and applying this to new technology. I'm not worried about us running off of the rails and building something really crazy that's going to be what people do not want to exist. And I do think Russia and China are going to do that. We have to be so much better than them that we can afford for them to play dirty and still win. And we can't do that by matching their technology. We have to be radically better. You can only be ethical in the modern space if you are so much better that you don't have to play dirty to win.
Why are you ethical?
Well, I mean, it shouldn't be about me. The question shouldn't be, is Palmer Luckey ethical? Is he the God? Well, just let me, sure. It's not about, is Palmer Luckey the God boy king who will lead us to salvation? Because that isn't what it should be, and it should never be that way. We need to trust in our government to regulate these things, for the government to figure out how these things are going to work, for the military to use them properly. I can think about these things ethically, and I put a lot of thought into how we're going to use them ethically. But the reason that people should not worry about the personality of one person in the technology industry being able to shift things one way or the other. I think we live in a country where that's not the case. I don't think one person can bend the military to their will, and that's a very good thing, and it's one of the things that makes us so different from Russia and China, where one person can bend the entire military to their particular singular will.
Although there is a huge difference between the government understanding of technology and technology. You saw Facebook in the congressional hearing where senators were trying to understand Facebook. Do you trust the government to be able to regulate the type of technology that's light years ahead?
Well, look, I lean libertarian. Obviously, I don't necessarily just trust the government blindly. I think the government could do a lot less in many cases and we'd be better off. But while the understanding may lag, the institutions are still very strong. And I think it does catch up in the same way where, look, the printing press was new at one point. A lot of people didn't understand the implications. And it took a while for everybody in government to understand it. And then when that became commonplace, people upheld that and they said, wow, like we understand this is a new technology that really changes the way that free speech plays out. And I think you've also seen that with a lot of, with the internet, with movies, with video games. People eventually catch on and they adapt. And I think they generally make decisions that, if not optimal, are at least directionally correct. We're not on a path downwards to becoming a dictatorship. We are on a path upwards to becoming a more productive and safer country.
I know you can't really talk too much about Facebook, so let's do a little dance around this, if
Sure.
we will. Being a conservative working for Facebook was blank, fill in the blank.
Well, I wasn't political when I was doing my work at Oculus. I was very, very focused on my work, focused on making virtual reality successful. So honestly, it was never an issue up until my politics became public. I was not out there talking about my politics publicly.
What was just so fascinating about your story, though, and I think, because in the time I've spoken to you, I've interviewed so many people, conservatives and shadows people,
Sure.
and the narrative of tech being polarized, and this idea that the decisions made at Facebook could be viewed as political is now mainstream.
Yes, it is true. It was considered a fringe conspiracy theory a few years ago, and I think people understand that there is a lot of bias in the most vocal people of Silicon Valley. They understand that there's a lot of people trying to tell their story and kind of force their companies to do what they want them to do rather than make the best business decision or even the best decision for their country.
Can those two be divided now? I mean, it certainly seems like tech companies are making more ethical or moral or taking more societal positions in this current administration. Do you think those things can be separate?
I think that they should be largely separate. I don't think that it's good for companies to do whatever is most popular. And that, at the end of the day, is what you're talking about. It's not really about ethics. It's not really about politics. It's not about one particular ideology. It's about doing what's popular, following the path of least resistance. And that's not a good way for companies to decide what they're going to work on and what they're not going to work on.
I know you, in your non-saying anything about Facebook, you said be careful who you trust and be careful who has control. What did you mean by that?
I was actually giving advice to entrepreneurs regarding like things that I learned. So there were other lessons there too. That was specifically talking about things that I would want other entrepreneurs to learn. Like, you should be careful who you trust, and you should also be willing to trust. Bring in people who are able to cover your weaknesses, work on the things that you're not good at. But also, be sure that they are people that you can trust. Don't bring in people who would make political ideology the #1 most important thing about how your company makes their decision-making process. If you have a mission that kind of transcends the politics of the moment, you'll be a lot more successful as a company, and you'll make a much bigger impact on the world.
So why should people trust you guys, especially given the background and the polarization where we're at? Looking at your own advice, be careful who you trust. Tell people why they should trust you guys.
Because we're a team of really thoughtful people who have a lot of experience working on defense problems, who have experience working on defense hardware and software, shipping consumer products to millions of different people. We've got a team who is thinking thoughtfully about these things and is really smart at building the right thing cost effectively on a reasonable schedule in a way that will save taxpayers hundreds of billions of dollars. If it comes down to why people, I wouldn't even bring politics into it, because we could flip that the other way, and I could say to a Democrat, well, why should we trust you? You supported the person I don't like. And I think this work is way too important to be thinking that way when you're deciding who's going to build the technology that keeps the United States safe. I work with Democrats, I work with socialists. There's socialists who work here, and I'm willing to work with them because we all agree the United States needs to have the best defense technology, and that is so much more important than any of our particular political leanings.
Is it hard to get good talent here? Because I know part of what will make you guys successful is that war on talent too, and getting the best engineers, Silicon Valley engineers. You guys are here, you're a different type of company, and you're not in Silicon Valley. Is it hard for you to recruit?
No, because we're so unique. There's so many people in the Valley and outside of it that want to work in defense and don't feel like there's a place they can go to work on it. People who feel like they are kind of trapped working in the consumer space because they don't want to work at traditional defense contractors. We are one of the very few places they can go and make a difference in that world. And so we've had a lot of great people coming in here. And a lot of them honestly don't really want to stay in Silicon Valley. I think I'd mentioned earlier, but it really only makes sense to stay in Silicon Valley if your business requires you to be there because your customers and your hires are. If your customers are all over the United States and your hires are from all over the United States, there's no reason to be in Silicon Valley. And actually there's a lot of people, in fact, most of the people at the company who came here from Silicon Valley. They're not Orange County natives. They're people who'd rather be here than in Silicon Valley because there's better cost of living, there is better infrastructure, like housing is a lot better, the schools are a lot better, and the weather is better, the food is better. Everything about it is better, except for the fact that it's not where Silicon Valley is.
Because you're not a typical Silicon Valley person, because you're not on message in the Silicon Valley kind of way, I'm assuming people say a lot of stuff to you that they wouldn't say publicly to the media or publicly. What are you hearing from the rumblings of Silicon Valley? What are people saying about this current moment in time with that spotlight and this microscope on Silicon Valley? What are people saying to you that they wouldn't say out loud? That
the current climate is going to destroy, how would you boil this down? There's been rumblings for a long time that Silicon Valley will eventually hit peak Silicon Valley, whatever that means, and then decline, and you'll see a lot of companies moving elsewhere. I think that the current political climate and the way that many of these people in Silicon Valley have chosen to respond to it has accelerated that process. You're going to have a lot more people looking at other places, looking around the country, thinking why they should be in Silicon Valley, surrounded by people who all think exactly the same thing, when they could be in another state and run their company twice as long on the same amount of money and be in a much healthier environment.
What do you mean when they talk about the way they responded to it?
Oh, in terms of this vocal, I think there's this vocal minority that thinks that they speak for Silicon Valley. And they'll go out there and say, these are Silicon Valley's values. Here in the Bay Area, this is what we believe. And I think they actually don't speak for the majority. They're just the best at being loud. And a lot of people don't want to live in a place where they're being defined by somebody else who's just louder than they are. They'd rather be someplace where it's cheaper and better and not quite so ideologically driven.
Going back to kind of the technology you guys are building here, because I want to make sure we have like a very specific idea of it. Take me to the robots that are fighting wildfire. Like, just take me, if you could just like visualize it. You know, we've spoken about it kind of broadly, but like, what exactly does that look like?
So what it would look like is still a lot of firefighters deployed out into the field who are managing these systems, but a lot of autonomous aerial vehicles and autonomous ground vehicles that are doing the heavy lifting of getting thousands of gallons of water and foam to the hottest parts of fires, fighting fires in ways that a person would never do because it's too risky. When we send people into a fire, we have to pull them out way before the fire gets to them because we don't want the fire to get blown over them and then them to be trapped inside of a fire where we can't get them. With a machine, we don't have that worry. We can fight up until the fire comes and then keep fighting. We can keep fighting even in the hottest parts of the fire because they're autonomous systems that are super well shielded, don't rely on oxygen, don't mind a lot of smoke, and they have sensors that are a lot better than our eyeballs to see through all that smoke and continue being effective.
What's the next iteration of that? Let's keep going with it. So what happens next? What's the next iteration?
Oh, like for firefighting in particular?
Yeah, or it goes even further. I mean.
It's more and more vehicles. It's better and better integration. You want to get to the point where fires are contained before they become big fires. Right now, we're at the point where we can help fight a large fire, but we want to actually build the technology that will be able to spot fires as they are growing, rather than after they're already this huge inferno. You know, you already have a lot of these fire watches that are out all over rural areas where people just live in these little houses and just watch for fires all day, all summer long. We can automate a lot of that process using lattice technology. And then we can see fires as soon as they're there and catch them much faster than a person would, because again, lattice has all kinds of sensor data available to it, all of which is much better than what a person gets with their eyeballs.
Do you think humans and machines will eventually kind of merge for when it comes to the future of technology and the future of defense technology?
Oh, I think the future of defense technology is humans and machines working seamlessly together, not as separate systems where a person is controlling the machine or where the machine is taking a person along for a ride, but where you have them seamlessly working together as one cohesive unit. And
what does that mean?
Well, like I should be able to tell a machine what to do and have it act on that. I shouldn't have to, let's say, I should not have to manually sit in a car to drive it along a convoy. Like you could say that's a fusion of man and machine, a guy sitting in a truck driving it. But that's not the type of fusion I'm talking about. I'm talking about where I can be a logistics manager and say, I need to get 10,000 pounds of food and water and ammunition to some remote group of soldiers. I'm going to send out an autonomous vehicle and just tell it where to go, and it's going to go and deliver it. And if it runs into a bomb along the way, nobody is killed. If it's ambushed along the way, nobody's killed. If I need to send twice as much food, I just send 2 of them. I'm not putting any more people in harm's way. So that's the type of seamless integration I'm talking about, where people and machines are working together on the same level with a common operating picture, knowing everything that's happening.
Okay, go with me here. I know I read something on Oculus when Oculus sold to Facebook, and how eventually we'd just be able to sense each other and feel each other, and they'd be able to read our minds and feel each other's thoughts.
The telepathy stuff.
The telepathy stuff. So let's apply that to what you're doing. First of all, is that completely out of the mix? Do you see in the future we're able to think things and have them happening, or is that just too far out?
I'm actually not a believer in direct neural interfaces to the brain. I am a big believer in peripheral nervous system interfaces. And that's a very long conversation about the 2 distinctions between those. And I think it's probably going to be years or maybe a decade before that conversation even really becomes relevant. But the idea is sound. The idea of kind of merging man and machine on a closer level is very sound. But I think it's a long way before we have to start thinking seriously about those things, because it is not at the place where VR was or where AR is, where it's kind of just about to happen. It is very much in the basic research stage, in the phase where we're still figuring out the basic science behind the principles.
But you think it could happen one day. What would it look like?
Well, people predict so many different models for how you would integrate man and machine that it's very hard to integrate what the successful model is going to end up being. But the future of defense is going to be closer and closer interactions between humans and between the machines that they work with, so that we can make the best possible decisions and have machines help us make those decisions.
As someone who has led the VR industry into kind of this new world, I heard someone say something, and now I've heard it multiple times, that I thought was fascinating, which is as technology kind of overtakes, I don't want to say overtakes humanity, I should take that back. As technology and humans merge, and as technology speeds up, at lightning speed, there will be people who are left behind. We're already seeing that. It's inevitable that there will be a class of folks left behind. And someone said something to me about how they find purpose. We'll have universal basic income, and how they'll find purpose, go with me here, is they'll be in a virtual world where it's about gaming and whatnot. As someone who's kind of been at the forefront of that, what do you think?
I think that's a defeatist view. I think the idea that there will inevitably be people left behind, like it may be true in an absolute sense, there will be individual people who are left behind, but I'm very optimistic that we are going to solve this problem, and I think humans fundamentally want to be productive. Humans don't want to just consume media. And I think that there's been lots of great media created over the years, and there's a reason that most people still find something to be passionate about and something to work on. I'm pretty optimistic about the future. I actually don't subscribe to the kind of nightmarish, everyone's going to be left behind and there will be nothing for anyone to do, and so we're going to just plug them into the Matrix machines and deal with it that way. I don't think that that's likely to happen. I think people will use VR more and more, and I think people will have more and more meaningful experiences in digital worlds. And I think they'll save a lot of time and money doing things in virtual worlds that they can't do in the real world. But I don't think that you're going to see pod people happening anytime soon. What
do you think is the single most ethical issue we have to look at when it comes to the future of technology and humanity?
I think that the most important issue is to look at the parallels between technology and addictive substances in the past. Not just the health impacts of, let's say, the tar of smoking cigarettes, but also the mental impacts of the nicotine and building a dependency. I think there's actually a lot of parallels where people are building technology to try and induce the exact same kind of loops that you see from addictive substances. And as we build better and better entertainment and better technology, I do think that we need to look at that and realize that everything has to be done in moderation and not try to get towards the perfect feedback loop. I'm not actually necessarily a fan of the ultimate social media app that's so good that I'm addicted to it and can't stop using it at any point. And I think we're already at the point where different people have different responses to this stuff. I think we're already at the point where some people are truly addicted to technology. And I think that as it gets more and more advanced, you're going to see more and more people that fall prey to that. And so I think that in the same way we saw a lot of campaigns to educate people about the dangers of drugs and the dangers of tobacco and the dangers of alcohol, I think you'll actually see campaigns to warn people about the dangers of becoming addicted to the technology that they should use for some period of time, but certainly not all their time.
How do you apply that to what you're doing now? People are addicted to gaming, to Call of Duty, to a lot of these video type games, and as war in the future inevitably begins to resemble
I think they're very separate issues. I think on the one side you have addiction to technology, on the other you have defense technology. I'm not worried about people becoming addicted to defense technology. When you're building a game, you're building it to entertain people in an optimal way. The systems that allow someone to fight a war and to have the best information are not like those. Like, another way to put this is, even if you end up with game-like interfaces for some of these autonomous systems, they're not going to be fun to use because they're not designed to be fun and delightful to use like a game. A game is about making you feel good. This is about being effective and making the right decision. So I don't think you're going to see overlap between the two.
Will you eventually build systems with the ability to kill people?
So right now, we're not building any of that stuff. We're building stuff that's about giving more information to people. At the same time, I wouldn't draw the line at building systems that kill people. I mean, in a way, the United States military is a system that does just that. And you kind of have to recognize that that is what's going to happen sometimes. You have to be willing to build technology for that whole system. You can't really divorce yourself from what the United States military is and say, I'm going to build technology for the military that does everything except for the step of actually killing people, and thus my hands are clean. You have to understand that sometimes lethal action is the only reaction that we can have.
Where will you draw the line?
Well, I don't know in what sense. Like in general, for example, one line I would draw is I do not want autonomous systems in general to be able to fire on humans without a person taking responsibility and being responsible for that action. Now, there have to be exceptions. For example, if I'm an aircraft carrier and I have a system that detects hypersonic missiles skimming over the waves, I'm probably going to need an automated system to blow that missile out of the sky because no person could possibly respond fast enough. But somebody would be responsible for turning on that system and saying, I'm taking responsibility for anything that comes this way. And I think that we're going to have a really strong, vigorous ethical debate as a country about how these things are implemented over the next decade. But I do think we're going to come into a much better place than Russia or China will on how we deploy these systems.
What is, like, when you think of China or Russia, like, and you've now kind of been digging into this, you feel obviously very strongly about this. What is, like, the scariest, like, let's just, like, terrify people, Palmer, like, what is the scariest thing that they're doing that you think, oh my God, like, this could be it?
It's really hard to predict, but the general fear, I think, is that they would continue to advance their ability to oppress their own people and expand their sphere of influence to oppress others and take away freedom, take away the voting rights, take away freedom of speech. That is the thing that I think that they would be willing to do and that they are on a path to do if somebody does not stop them.
And it certainly seems like technology over the last couple of years has been the way that China, that Russia has been able, I mean, this is nothing new, but has been able to weaponize against the United States?
I think it's part of a very large toolbox. I think it's very easy to focus on those particular few things, but I mean, when you're fighting countries in a proxy war and there's guys overseas that are fighting actual military hardware, like, I don't think they would agree that the primary way they've attacked us is through, let's say, social media. I think they'd say, no, they're attacking us with guns and rocket launchers and drones. Like, those are the things that those people are worried about. So it's part of a toolbox, but I'm worried about all of it. You
talk a lot about, like, regulations, how we're going to have some kind of regulatory systems for a lot of the stuff coming down the pipeline. I did a story on a woman who claimed she was assaulted in the virtual world, and did it count? And,
okay.
It brought this really interesting question of, does that count? Do you think that there should be regulations in the virtual world as this? I know you've said that the final medium is virtual reality, so should there be regulatory? I know that's far-reaching, but should there be regulations? What should count? What shouldn't count in the virtual world?
I'll stop an inch short of saying there should be regulation because I'm not sure exactly what it would be or how it should be. But I do believe that as we spend more and more time living in digital worlds, we're going to get to the point where we have to understand that you have not just regulations, but also preservation of rights in these digital spaces. I don't want to live in a world where we have freedom of speech in the physical world, but we actually spend so much time in the digital world where we have no freedom of speech, where what we can say is controlled by corporations, what we can do is controlled by a handful of companies. I think that people are going to have to look at that issue in a much broader way than just regulation of virtual spaces.
Right. I mean, I don't want to live in a virtual world where I could be assaulted and it doesn't count. You know?
Sure. Well, and I don't know what the right way to handle that is. Like, I don't think right now it would make sense for the government to come in and say, it is illegal to do X, Y, or Z in a video game. But I do think that it's something that we need to look at as we move closer and closer towards that future.
Palmer Luckey, 17 years old. You're 26 now. Who is Palmer at 17 compared to who you are at 26?
We're pretty similar. I just know a lot more now.
Like what?
I've learned a lot more about how the technology industry works. I've learned a lot more about how the government works. I've become a lot more aware of problems outside of my little sphere that I cared about. When I was 17, I mostly cared about whether or not I was going to be able to make the best possible virtual reality headset. And now I'm a lot more concerned about foreign entities and how they're impacting the world in the United States. But I'd say in most cases, I'm mostly the same. I still like the same stuff. I still hold mostly the same views. And it's been quite a ride.
What do you mean?
Well, I've been through a lot. Not a lot of people get to start a company, sell it for billions of dollars, and then get exiled from Silicon Valley and start another company. And I'm only 26 years old, so who knows what the future holds.
I know, you've been really busy. I'm interested to see what 30-year-old Palmer looks like compared to 26, given all the stuff you've done and been kicked out for in the contrarian view. That's why I think you're a pretty interesting figure when it comes to this stuff.
Well, it's really hard to predict, but I do think that we're going to do some really important things. Like, I think we are working on probably the most important technology. When I left Oculus, I was actually looking at a few different things that I could work on that would be really, really impactful, and this is the thing that I judge to be the most impactful of those things.
Was it hard for you leaving, given that you have lived and breathed? I think that there are very few founders I've met that live and embody and breathe their products like you. Was it hard when you left, given how much Oculus was you and you are Oculus?
Yes.
Okay. I was reading up on you and I saw that Brendan, your co-founder, at first had trouble tracking you down initially because you were worried about government surveillance and didn't have a cell phone.
That's right.
And now you're building government surveillance tools. So isn't that a little bit ironic?
Yes, yes it is. But I think I've learned a lot more about the realities of how this stuff works, and I think that has shifted my view on that. I mean, I have a phone.
Right, right. I mean, what do you think what was the shift for you? I mean, why you went from this, I don't want to say crazy, I say crazy in an interesting way, this crazy kid this crazy kid who doesn't have a phone and you have to track down on these forums to find you, and you know, and now we're literally sitting in a place where you're building out defense technology for the government with planes flying overhead. So what was the biggest shift? I mean,
I think it shows that I was thinking about these problems then, and that I've continued thinking about them. I just have come to a different conclusion than I was in when I had, at that point I had not worked with people in the defense community. I had not worked with people in the government. And so I'd say, like, working in an Army-funded research lab, going on to start Oculus, getting to know a lot of people in the defense community, made me realize that maybe I was a little worried about the wrong things. I find it hard to be worried about my cell phone when there are countries out there that are locking up people around the world for disagreeing with them, and building a better military than we are is their goal. That just scares me a lot more. So you kind of end up shifting your priorities.
I want to read you something that Stephen wrote in the Wired piece, because I thought it was really interesting. He said, the same technologies that once seemed full of promise are finding their way into all too human clashes led by a company named after an avenging sword.
I wouldn't classify Unreal as an avenging sword anyway. So we could disagree on Lord of the Rings lore and what that particular fantasy sword represents. But I think that humanity will bend technology to its will. I do not think it's the other way around. And I don't think that I don't think technology controls us. I don't think technology controls how we work on technology. I think we are very much building the right tools for the job. And name of the company aside, I'm very proud of what we're doing, and that we are building something that protects Western values and Western ideals that these other countries don't hold. In other words, it is an interesting thought, but I'm not sure that you can have much of a response, except to say, I don't think it's an avenging sword, and we're using the technology in a good way. And we are thinking about it in a thoughtful way. We're thinking about it in a way that ensures that we're using it the right way. But I don't think of it as warping technology or building technology to avenge anything.
What is the unintended consequence of the technology that you guys are building?
So I think, we've been talking for a while, but I think my premise is pretty clear. I think that we are going to end up in a really good place. Like, I don't think there will be unintended consequences. I think that the unintended consequences that may exist along the way to figuring out how this stuff works will be unintended and almost by definition unknowable. If we were able to know what they would be, then we would be even more likely to ensure that that's never the problem we're going to hit. And so of all of the things that I could think about, like I'd say you could say worry would be that you would build autonomous systems that are going to go out of control and end humanity and kill everybody. But because everyone is concerned about that, it's much easier to ensure that that's never going to happen. The technology just isn't at that point, and you can't accidentally create technology that does those things.
What do people get wrong about you?
Oh man, where do I get started? I think that a lot of people think that I prioritize things differently than I do, and they don't understand that, a lot of people assume that politics must be the most important thing for me when I'm deciding what to do, because it's the thing that they've been force-fed the most about me. And it's just not the case. That's not how I decide what problems to work on. It's not how I decide what people to work with. I want to work with people who I share a common goal with, and I'm willing to work with anyone who believes almost anything.
Have your politics changed at all?
A little bit. Some of the stuff we talked earlier about working with the defense community, I'd say I probably leaned a little more libertarian in terms of how all of that worked. But I'd say no, generally I've stayed pretty consistent.